The blood-stained letter lay on the supermarket floor, its smeared ink spelling out something almost illegible. Just one word still clear. Run. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead as the camera zoomed out slowly, revealing the vast, desolate store. Shelves stood eerily silent. Cartons lay toppled. A trail of crimson led from aisle 5 to the cold glow of the freezer section. Taniwar. The phone behind the service desk rang endlessly, unanswered. Sirens wailed somewhere beyond the foggy glass doors. The woman's body, cold, pale, and twisted at an odd angle, rested in the frozen foods aisle, blood glistening around her like a chilling halo. She had been the last to see him alive. That much was certain. But even now she couldn't remember that night. Not fully. Just fragments. A scream. A flash of red. A hand reaching. Then blackness. The silence now was worse than the scream. It was as though the building itself was holding its breath. Sarah stared at the photo in front of her, the last image taken before Jake disappeared. In it, he smiled, half-posed, standing beneath the store's buzzing, "Open 24 hours" sign. She traced the corner of the image with her trembling finger, trying to remember what happened that night. But her memory was fractured, clouded by fear. At the police station, they asked her again and again, "What did you see, Sarah?" But all she could offer were half-truths. "I remember his coat, red." He turned to say something, but then I blinked and he was gone. Her voice cracked. She hadn't asked to be part of this. Yet now, she was all they had. A witness. A suspect. A survivor. Sarah said softly, "I was just buying milk. I didn't ask for this." But that didn't matter. Not anymore. The night Jake disappeared wasn't unusual, until it was. They'd laughed walking through the parking lot, bags rustling in their hands. Sarah remembered him joking about cereal brands. But then there was a crash. A metal banged. And just like that, Jake wasn't beside her anymore. Panic rose. She called his name, her voice echoing into the darkness. Security cameras captured her running back inside, wild-eyed, searching every aisle. In aisle 7, she found his wallet, still warm. Her breath hitched. It was like he had vanished into thin air. But someone had taken him. She was sure of it. And whoever it was, they hadn't finished yet. Detective Harlan reviewed the footage over and over. Jake never left the store. At least, not on camera. He watched Sarah's figure dart between shelves, her hands shaking. The timestamp didn't lie. Only 10 minutes between the last footage of Jake and when Sarah started screaming. But what struck him most wasn't what he saw. It was what he didn't. There were gaps. Static bursts. Glitches. "Someone tampered with this," he murmured. The tech team shrugged. Could be electrical. But Harlan didn't buy it. He'd seen this before. Someone knew how to erase their presence. But Sarah's terrified face? That wasn't fake. That was real. In the days after Jake vanished, Sarah's world spiraled. Reporters camped outside her home. Neighbors whispered, "Nee." She couldn't sleep without hearing his voice. Or footsteps that weren't hers. She kept going back to the store, standing outside, staring into the darkened interior through the locked doors. Once, she thought she saw him, just beyond the freezer. But when she blinked, he was gone. Her therapist said it was trauma-induced hallucinations. But Sarah knew better. She wasn't imagining it. Jake was trying to reach her. Or warn her. Something terrible had happened in that supermarket, and it wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, Mason arrived at the supermarket where the body had been found. The store was open for business, the usual hustle and bustle of customers filling the air. But there was an unspoken tension that lingered. As she walked through the aisles, she could still feel the ghost of the crime scene, the chilling memory of the woman's body lying in the freezer aisle. Officer Daniels stood near the entrance, scanning the crowd. "Anything new?" Mason asked, glancing around. "Not much," Daniels replied. "But we managed to track down the suspect's address. He's local. His name's Thomas Blake. Mason nodded. Let's pay him a visit. The investigation had just taken a serious turn. With a name to follow, the chase was on. But something in the back of Mason's mind told her that Blake was not the only one hiding something. Mason and Daniels stood in front of a modest house on the edge of town. It was quiet here, far from the bustle of the supermarket, and the surrounding homes were neatly kept. They approached the door, and Mason rang the bell. The door opened slowly to reveal a man in his mid-30s, wearing an old t-shirt and jeans. His eyes widened when he saw them. "Can I help you?" Blake asked, his voice shaky. "We're investigating a crime," Mason replied. "You're Thomas Blake, correct?" Blake hesitated, but nodded. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about the supermarket," Mason continued, her tone firm but not aggressive. "Can we come in?" Blake's eyes darted to the door behind him, then back to Mason. Reluctantly, he stepped aside. "Sure, come in." As they entered, Mason noticed the place was too neat, almost unnervingly so, as if he was trying to hide something. Inside, the atmosphere felt tense. Mason sat down on a worn couch, while Daniels stood by the window, his eyes scanning the room. Blake paced nervously, glancing at the door as if he was about to bolt. Mason broke the silence. "We know you were at the supermarket the morning of the murder. We need to know what you were doing there." Blake stopped pacing and looked at her. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just getting some groceries. I didn't see anything." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Didn't see anything? Not even a dead body in the freezer aisle?" Blake flinched, but his face remained impassive. "I didn't know about the body until the news. I swear." Mason leaned forward. "Then why did you leave your shopping cart behind in the store?" Blake's eyes shifted, and for a brief moment, Mason saw the truth flicker in his eyes. But he quickly recovered, his face returning to its neutral mask. I don't know. I must have forgotten about it." After a tense few moments, Mason stood up. "We're done here for now, Mr. Blake, but we'll be back." Blake didn't respond, his eyes still fixed on her as she turned to leave. The door clicked shut behind them, and Mason exchanged a look with Daniels. "Something doesn't add up," Daniels muttered. "His story seems off." Mason nodded. "He's lying about something, but I'm not sure what yet." They climbed into the car, the air thick with unanswered questions. Mason sat back, replaying the conversation in her mind. Blake was hiding something, but it wasn't clear what. The puzzle pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture still felt incomplete. "We need to dig into his background," Mason said. "Find out what we're missing." Back at the station, Mason sat at her desk, the files spread out in front of her. She was deep in thought when Daniels came in, holding a stack of papers. "Here's the info on Blake," he said, placing the papers in front of her. Mason skimmed through the report. Nothing seemed unusual at first glance. Blake had no criminal record, was employed at a local mechanic shop, and had no obvious connections to the victim. But then her eyes stopped at one detail. "Wait a minute," she said, pointing to a line in the report. "He was in a car accident 6 months ago. He was treated at the same hospital as the victim." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting. What's the connection?" Mason leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. "This could be the break we need. Let's look deeper into that hospital visit. It might lead us to something we're missing." Mason's phone rang sharply, pulling her out of her deep thoughts. It was Daniels. "We've got something," he said urgently. "We dug into Blake's hospital visit. Turns out he was treated for a serious injury 6 months ago, but there's something more." Mason's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Daniels hesitated for a moment. "The victim, Sarah Green, was admitted to the same hospital around the same time. They were both treated for injuries after a car accident. We think they might know each other." Mason leaned forward, her mind racing. "Is that the connection?" "Maybe. We need to track down Sarah Green's records and find out how close they really were." Mason stood, her decision made. "Let's go. This could be the breakthrough we need." Mason and Daniels arrived at the hospital just before closing time. The cold fluorescent lights flickered overhead as they approached the records department. The woman behind the counter looked up at them with mild curiosity, but her expression quickly turned to concern when they identified themselves as police. "What can I help you with?" she asked cautiously. "We need to look at the medical records of Sarah Green and Thomas Blake," Mason said, showing her badge. The woman hesitated before nodding. "I'll get you the information, but it'll take a few minutes." They waited in silence, the tension mounting between them. Mason glanced at Daniels, who was flipping through his notes. Something didn't sit right with her. Why had Blake been so insistent on denying any knowledge of the victim? The answer felt like it was just out of reach, but she was determined to find it. The woman returned with the records. "Here you go," she said, handing them over without a word. Mason took the file and began scanning the documents. As she read, her heart sank. Blake and Green had not only been treated at the same hospital, but they had both been involved in the same car accident. The reports showed they were in the same vehicle, which was strange considering Blake's claim of not knowing Sarah. "Why didn't he tell us this?" Mason muttered, flipping through the pages. Daniels peered over her shoulder. "Maybe he's hiding something." Mason nodded. "We need to talk to Sarah Green, now." But something about the records was nagging at her, a detail she couldn't put her finger on yet. The truth was closer than ever, but there was one more piece to this puzzle, and she was determined to find it. Mason and Daniels drove in silence towards Sarah Green's apartment. The connection between Blake and Sarah was undeniable now, and it seemed that whatever happened during the accident had left more than just physical scars. It was clear that the two of them shared a dark secret. They arrived at the building, its cracked windows and peeling paint offering a stark contrast to the once bright and welcoming interior. Mason knocked on Sarah's door, her hand steady but her heart pounding. When the door opened, Sarah stood there, looking disheveled, her eyes red, as if she hadn't slept in days. "You're Sarah Green?" Mason asked, her voice soft but direct. Sarah nodded, her face full of fear. "What do you want from me?" "We need to talk to you about the accident, and about Thomas Blake." Inside the apartment, Sarah sat on the couch, wringing her hands nervously as Mason and Daniels sat across from her. The air was thick with tension. "I don't know what you want from me," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason leaned forward. "We know you were in the accident with Thomas Blake. You were both treated at the same hospital. We need to know what happened." Sarah looked away, tears brimming in her eyes. I can't talk about it." Mason's voice softened. "Sarah, you need to help us. This is bigger than just you and Blake. People are dying because of what happened that day. You can stop it." Sarah finally looked at Mason, her face twisted with pain. "I can't, but I can tell you one thing. Thomas didn't just hurt me, he hurt someone else too." Mason's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" But before Sarah could respond, there was a sudden knock at the door. Someone outside was listening. The knock on the door sent a jolt of fear through Sarah. Her body stiffened as Mason and Daniels exchanged a glance. They hadn't expected anyone else. Mason stood and moved toward the door, cautiously peering through the peephole. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the silhouette of a man standing on the other side. "Who is it?" Mason called, her voice steady but her pulse racing. "It's Thomas Blake," came the muffled response. Sarah's face turned pale as she took a step back, panic flashing across her eyes. "I can't face him, not after everything." Mason glanced back at Sarah, then nodded to Daniels. "Stay here." She opened the door, her gun discreetly held at her side. Blake stood there, his face contorted in anger, but he quickly masked it when he saw Mason. "I need to talk to Sarah," he demanded. "We need to talk to you first," Mason replied, blocking the door. Blake tried to push past Mason, but she quickly stepped in front of him, her voice unwavering. "I said, we need to talk first." Blake's face flushed red, his fists clenching at his sides. "I haven't done anything wrong," he shouted, his eyes darting nervously. Mason took a step closer, her voice calm yet commanding. "We know about the accident. We know about Sarah. You've been lying to us. Blake's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. You don't understand, he muttered, his voice cracking. I didn't want her to get involved in all of this. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. Mason's eyes narrowed. Then why did you leave her for dead? Why didn't you call for help? Blake remained silent, the weight of his guilt evident in his posture. Sarah's voice trembled from inside. He's not the only one hiding something. Mason's attention snapped to Sarah, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Mason stepped back inside, Blake reluctantly following her into the apartment. Sarah remained seated on the couch, her hands trembling in her lap. Blake kept his distance, shifting uncomfortably. What aren't you telling us, Blake? Mason asked, her voice steady as she glanced between the two. Blake swallowed hard, avoiding Mason's gaze. I didn't mean to hurt her, It was an accident. The crash wasn't my fault. Sarah's eyes flared with sudden emotion, her voice cutting through the air. That's not true, she shouted. You weren't just in the car with me, you. Mason held up a hand, signaling Sarah to stop. What do you mean? Sarah hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. He was the one who... I wasn't supposed to survive the crash. He tried to make sure I didn't. The room fell silent, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. Mason's heart raced as the truth began to unfold. Blake's expression flickered between anger and fear, his body tense as he struggled to find words. You don't understand, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want her to know the truth. I didn't want anyone to know. What truth? Mason demanded, stepping closer. The crash. It wasn't an accident, Blake admitted, his voice shaking now. I was driving too fast and I panicked. When we crashed, I thought she was dead, so I left her there. But when I saw her later, I knew I had to make sure she didn't speak. Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with shock. You tried to kill me. Blake looked at her, his face twisted with guilt and despair. I didn't want anyone to know. I couldn't risk it. Mason's gaze hardened. You'll never get away with this. Blake sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face as he finally gave in to the weight of his guilt. I didn't want to hurt her. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. But I was scared, he sobbed. Mason watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable. You didn't just hurt her, Blake. You killed someone else, and you almost killed her too. The room was silent, except for Blake's muffled sobs. Sarah stood up slowly, her face hardening. You don't get to cry now. You've already taken so much from me. Mason took out her phone, dialing for backup. You're under arrest for attempted murder, and we'll be charging you for the other death as well. Blake's sobs grew louder as the door to the apartment opened behind Mason. Daniel stepped in, his face grim as he looked at the scene unfolding. It's over, Blake, Mason said, her voice cold. You'll face justice. The courtroom was quiet, the tension palpable as Blake sat at the defendant's table, his eyes downcast. Mason sat in the front row, watching closely as the prosecutor began to speak. The charges were clear. 2 counts of attempted murder, 1 for Sarah, and 1 for the woman who had died in the crash. The evidence was overwhelming. Blake's attempts to conceal the truth, to silence Sarah, were now laid bare. Blake's lawyer stood and made a final plea, trying to appeal to the jury's sense of mercy. But it was no use. Mason knew the truth would win out. Blake had been afraid, yes, but fear was no excuse for murder. Sarah had survived, but many others hadn't. It was time for justice to be served. As the judge began to speak, Mason's heart pounded in anticipation. The case that had haunted her for weeks was finally nearing its end. The jury deliberated for hours, the clock ticking down. Mason paced outside the courtroom, feeling the weight of the case pressing on her shoulders. Daniel stood beside her, silently waiting for the verdict. She could hardly believe how far this case had come, from the cold, lifeless body in the freezer aisle to this moment. It was almost over. Think we'll get a conviction? Daniels asked, his voice breaking the silence. I don't see how they can't, Mason replied, her tone firm. We have the evidence. We have the truth. Just then, the door to the courtroom opened, and the bailiff called for them. The jury had reached a verdict. Mason's heart skipped a beat as they entered the room, ready for the final chapter to be written. The courtroom fell silent as the jury returned, their faces grim. Mason watched intently as the foreman stood, holding the verdict in his hand. Woo, the jury find the defendant, Thomas Blake, guilty of 2 counts of attempted murder, 1 for Sarah Green, and 1 for the deceased. Mason's breath caught in her throat, the weight of the words hitting her like a wave. Blake's face remained impassive, but his hands clenched into fists as the sentence was read aloud. Sarah sat beside Mason, her face a mixture of relief and sorrow. She had survived the crash, but she had lost so much in the process. Her future, her peace, was forever altered by Blake's actions. Mason looked at her, offering a quiet, reassuring smile. Justice had been served. But there was no celebration. Not yet. The journey ahead would be long, but today, at least, they had won. After the verdict, Mason stood outside the courthouse, watching as Blake was led away in handcuffs. She felt a sense of relief, but also a deep weariness. The night had been long, and it had taken its toll on everyone involved. Sarah approached her, her face still carrying the weight of everything she had been through. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, her voice tinged with both gratitude and sorrow. Mason nodded. "You're welcome. It's not over for you, Sarah. But I hope this brings you some peace." "I'm not sure I'll ever have peace," Sarah replied softly. "But I can start to rebuild now. I can move forward." Mason gave her a small smile, watching as Sarah walked away. She had helped her survive, but Sarah had to find her own way forward from here. Mason turned toward Daniels, ready for the next case. There would always be another one, but this one had been personal. As Mason drove home that night, the weight of the case finally began to settle in. It had taken everything she had to get to this point. The murder, the lies, the cover-up. It had all come crashing down. But the hardest part was knowing that, for all the justice they had fought for, the scars left behind would never fully fade. Mason parked in front of her house, the streetlights casting long shadows across the quiet street. She sat there for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, reflecting on everything that had happened. "You did good, Mason," Daniel's voice echoed in her mind. She smiled faintly, the familiar weight of the job lifting off her shoulders. For now, she had won. But tomorrow, the work would begin again. There would always be another case, another fight. But that was what she did. She fought for the truth. It had been a week since Blake's conviction, but Mason couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still unresolved. The case was closed, but there were loose ends that clung to her like shadows. She sat at her desk, flipping through the case files again, the dim light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the papers. The clock ticked loudly in the silence. Daniels knocked softly before entering, holding a file in his hands. "You're still at it?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "I can't help it," Mason replied, glancing up. "Something doesn't sit right. Why did Blake try to kill Sarah? What's the real story behind that accident?" Daniels set the file down in front of her. "Maybe it's time we look at things from a different angle. I found something strange in the evidence we overlooked. Blake's phone records." Mason's interest peaked. "What did you find?" Daniels smiled grimly. "A connection we missed. Let's take a look." Mason flipped through the phone records, her eyes scanning the numbers. There it was, buried deep in the call log. Several calls made to an unknown number just days before the accident. The number had been dialed multiple times, including just hours before the crash. "Who's this?" she muttered to herself, tapping the name written next to the number. It was listed as a burner phone, untraceable. "This wasn't just an accident," Mason said, leaning back in her chair. "Blake was in contact with someone who may have pushed him to do this." Daniels looked over her shoulder. "What do we do now?" "We track down the owner of that number. Whoever's behind this may have orchestrated the whole thing." Mason stood up, determination flashing in her eyes. This case wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Mason and Daniels visited the phone company the next morning, hoping to get a lead on the burner phone. Thor was busy, with customers milling about, but they were focused, intent on finding answers. The store manager, a young woman, hesitated when Mason showed her badge. "I don't know if I can help," the manager said nervously, glancing at Daniels. "We just need to trace one phone number," Mason said, her voice firm. "It's important." After a tense moment, the manager nodded. "I'll need to check with my supervisor, but I'll try." Minutes later, the manager returned with a name. "It's registered to a Jacob Calloway. He lives just outside town at an old farm." Mason's heart raced. Calloway, she knew that name. It had been connected to an unsolved case from years ago, a case that had never been fully investigated. The connection was becoming clearer. "Let's pay him a visit," Mason said, her voice resolute. Mason and Daniels drove out to the farm, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. The farm was isolated, surrounded by fields and tall fences, the silence broken only by the hum of distant birds. When they arrived at the front gate, a dog barked furiously, but no one came out to greet them. "Something's not right," Daniels muttered, eyeing the dark farmhouse. Mason nodded, her instincts telling her that they weren't here for a friendly chat. As they approached the door, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, tall and wiry, his face hardened by years of hard work. "I'm Jacob Calloway," the man said, his voice cold. "What do you want?" "We're investigating a connection between you and Thomas Blake," Mason replied, her eyes narrowing. "We need to talk." Calloway stepped back, his eyes darting nervously. "I don't know anything about that," he said, his tone too defensive. "We'll see about that," Mason said, stepping forward, her voice firm. Inside the farmhouse, Calloway led them to a cluttered living room, the smell of dust and old wood heavy in the air. He sat across from Mason and Daniels, avoiding their eyes. "You were involved with Blake, weren't you?" Mason asked, her voice calm but penetrating. Calloway remained silent, his hands tightly gripping the edge of the chair. "I know about the calls," Mason continued. "And I know you were in contact with Blake before the accident. Why?" Calloway's jaw tightened, and he finally looked up. "Blake, he was desperate. He didn't know what to do. I gave him some advice, but I didn't push him into anything." "Advice?" Daniels pressed. "What kind of advice?" Calloway's face darkened. "I didn't tell him to kill anyone, but I did tell him he needed to get rid of the woman. She knew too much." Mason's heart skipped a beat. Sarah had been right all along. She hadn't survived the crash by accident. Blake had been manipulated, and someone else had pulled the strings. Mason stood in the dimly lit hallway outside the interrogation room, listening to the muffled sounds of Calloway's voice from inside. She and Daniels had managed to get him to confess, but the pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting perfectly yet. Who was behind the entire operation? "This isn't over yet," Mason said quietly to Daniels. "We still don't know who put Calloway up to it." Daniels nodded, his expression tense. "You think there's someone else pulling the strings?" Mason didn't answer immediately, her mind racing. Blake was scared, but Calloway was more than just a middleman. Someone is controlling this, and we need to find out who. As they walked back to the interrogation room, Mason's phone buzzed. A message from forensics. They'd found something. Something big. "It's time," she muttered, her voice filled with resolve. "Let's go." Inside the forensics lab, the technician looked up as Mason and Daniels entered, holding up a small evidence bag. "We found something in Calloway's barn," the technician said, handing the bag to Mason. Mason opened the bag, revealing a collection of photographs, grainy but clear enough to make out faces. They were images of Sarah, taken in the weeks leading up to the accident. Someone had been watching her. "Who would do this?" Daniels asked, his voice low. Mason stared at the photos, her mind spinning. The pattern was emerging, the connections forming. "It's not just about Blake. Whoever's behind this has been manipulating everything from the start. And they've been watching Sarah all along." Mason turned to Daniels. We need to find out who these people are before they disappear again. With the photographs in hand, Mason and Daniels returned to Sarah's apartment, hoping to find more clues. Sarah greeted them at the door, her face a mix of exhaustion and fear. We found something, Mason said, holding up the photographs. Someone's been watching you. We need to know everything you can remember from the days before the crash. Sarah's eyes widened as she took the photos, her hands shaking. I don't know who these people are, she whispered, staring at the pictures. Mason stepped closer, her tone gentle but insistent. Sarah, you have to remember, there's a reason you were targeted. You know something, even if you don't realize it. Sarah's face went pale as the realization hit her. The night of the crash, there was someone else in the car. I wasn't alone, but I never saw their face. I only remember the voice. Mason's heart skipped a beat. Tell me what you remember about the voice. The investigation took a sharp turn. Sarah's vague memory of the voice led them to a name, Martin Henderson. He was someone from Sarah's past, a figure she'd tried to forget. They tracked him down to a remote location on the outskirts of town. As they arrived, Mason's gut told her that this wasn't going to be an easy confrontation. Henderson was dangerous, someone who knew how to manipulate the system to get what he wanted. They knocked on the door of a rundown house, but there was no answer. The windows were dark, the silence deafening. We need to break in, Mason said, her voice tight. Daniels nodded, his hand resting on his gun. I'll go first. Mason followed closely behind as they entered the house, their footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. They found what they were looking for in the basement. Henderson had been hiding in plain sight, and now the pieces were falling into place. Inside the basement, they found Henderson, sitting at a makeshift desk, surrounded by documents and old photos. His face twisted into a smile as they entered, his eyes cold and calculating. You found me, he said, his voice laced with bitterness. But it's too late. You'll never stop what's already in motion. Mason's eyes narrowed. You were the one behind everything. You manipulated Blake, used him to do your dirty work. But it's over now. Henderson stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. You think I'm the mastermind? You're wrong. There's someone else. What do you mean? Daniels asked, stepping forward. Henderson smirked. You'll never find them. They're too smart, too powerful. But you've done your part. You'll never stop it now. With one last look, Henderson was taken into custody. But Mason knew this wasn't over. Someone else was still out there, and the truth was far from fully revealed.